Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
There's nothing partisan or political about protecting dreamers. Yet our dreamers hang in limbo with a cruel cloud of fear and uncertainty above them. The Republican moral cowardice must end.
Congress votes to end a brief government shutdown, but the spending bill offers no protection for dreamers, the young undocumented immigrants. We go to Korea for the latest on the opening ceremonies at the Olympics.
So today, the Olympics begin in Pyeongchang, South Korea, and North and South Korean athletes will be marching together in the opening ceremony carrying a One Korea flag. This is extraordinary. We would have never imagined this a month ago as tensions reached a boiling point. And unfortunately, as this incredibly hopeful peace process is taking place, U.S. Vice President Mike Pence is there to sow bitterness and discord.
Then to the speech that would be the nail in the coffin for so many. 15 years ago this week, February 5th, 2003, Secretary of State General Colin Powell gave a speech to the UN arguing for war with Iraq, saying the evidence was clear Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. It was a speech Powell would later call a blot on his career. Is Trump doing the same thing with Iran? We'll speak with General Powell's former Chief of Staff, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Congress has given final approval to a massive budget bill that will add thousands of billions of dollars in military and domestic spending over the next 2 years, without an agreement to protect young undocumented immigrants. The deal was reached in the early morning hours after a delay by Kentucky Republican Senator Rand Paul extended debate past midnight, leading briefly to a federal government shutdown, the second in recent weeks. This is Senator Rand Paul.
We have a 700-page bill that no one has read that was printed at midnight. No one will read this bill. Nothing will be reformed. The waste will continue, and government will keep taking your money irresponsibly and adding to a $20 trillion debt.
The bill failed to meet the demands of immigrant rights groups and many Democrats who wanted protection for young undocumented immigrants as part of any spending agreement. The House vote was 240 to 186 this morning. Among those voting no was New York Congressmember Nydia Vásquez, who tweeted, quote, "My decision wasn't easy, but we are elected to take tough votes, and leaving dreamers behind is simply unacceptable." Despite her opposition and a no vote from Democratic Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi, 73 House Democrats voted yes and helped the measure pass. We'll have more on the congressional budget agreement and the fight to protect dreamers after headlines. On Wall Street, the Dow Jones stock market index fell by more than 1,000 points Thursday, in the second major loss for U.S. stocks in a week. The tumble brought stock prices down by over 10% in what economists officially call a correction. Shares in Asian and European stock markets were also sharply down. In Pyeongchang, South Korea, the 2018 Winter Olympics have opened with North and South Korean athletes marching together for the first time ever. The Games are seen as a pivotal moment for relations between the two countries, who have been officially at war since 1950. In an effort to de-escalate tensions on the Korean peninsula, North Korea has sent a 500-person delegation of athletes, musicians, and performers to the Olympics. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un's influential sister attended today's opening ceremony and shook hands with South Korean leader Moon Jae-in. The pair are scheduled to have lunch together. But as the peninsula tries to de-escalate the threat of nuclear war, Vice President Mike Pence has warned the U.S. is slated to impose another round of sanctions against North Korea. We'll have more on the 2018 Winter Olympics and tensions on the peninsula later in the broadcast. Meanwhile, the vice president's office is denying that Vice President Pence offered to meet with openly gay U.S. men's figure skater Adam Rippon, calling a report in USA Today fake news. The report was authored by journalist Christine Brennan, who spoke on PBS NewsHour about her recent interview with Adam Rippon.
Many things, including Mike Pence being the delegation leader for the U.S. at the opening ceremonies. And Adam Rippon said that, he goes, Mike Pence, the same Mike Pence who funded gay conversion therapy, he said, I'm not buying it, and was very critical of Pence and President Trump.
The White House said Thursday it mishandled the case of Rob Porter, who resigned as staff secretary this week after two of his ex-wives accused him of verbal and physical abuse. This is Deputy White House Press Secretary Raj Shah.
I think it's fair to say that you know, we all could have done better over the last few hours or last few days in dealing with this situation. But you know, this was a Rob Porter that I and many others have dealt with, that Sarah dealt with, that other officials, including the chief of staff, had dealt with. And the emerging reports were not reflective of the individual who we had come to know.
Shah's statement came as multiple news outlets reported senior White House officials, including Chief of Staff General John Kelly, knew for months that the FBI had heard testimony from Porter's ex-wives about verbal and physical abuse. That contradicts Kelly's account that he was not fully aware of the abuse until this week. Kelly initially supported Porter, describing him in a statement as a, quote, man of true integrity and honor. The statement was reportedly drafted in part by White House Communications Director Hope Hicks, who's in a romantic relationship with Porter. Porter stepped down Wednesday after The Intercept published photos of his first wife, Kobe Holderness, showing her with a black eye she says she suffered when Porter punched her during a trip to Italy in 2005. The photos released came as Porter's second wife, Jennifer Willoughby, also went public to detail abuse. This is Willoughby speaking with The Washington Post.
I did know that my marriage was bad. I knew that it wasn't healthy, that the fights and the verbal and emotional abuse that I was enduring was not, quote unquote, normal. But I don't think that I had yet put myself in the category of someone whose husband laid hands on her until that moment.
The FBI had denied Rob Porter permanent clearance to handle classified information because of the allegations. Meanwhile, the Washington Post reports dozens of other White House employees lack permanent security clearances as they pursue FBI approval to handle sensitive information. Among them, Jared Kushner, President Trump's son-in-law and senior advisor, who failed to report over 100 foreign contacts on his initial application, which he has since revised 3 times. In Guatemala, press freedom groups are demanding swift government action after 2 journalists were found murdered in an apparent execution. On February 1st, the bodies of Laurent Angel Castillo Cifuentes and Luis Alfredo de Leon Miranda were found in a field near the town of Santo Domingo. Their hands and feet were bound, and both had been shot in the head. In a statement, the Committee to Protect Journalists said the killings will, quote, further chill the climate for press freedom in Guatemala, where journalists work with constant fear of intimidation and violence. The Association of Journalists of Guatemala reported 11 media workers were killed in Guatemala last year. Bermuda's governor has signed a bill that rescinds the right of same-sex couples to marry. The new law reverses a ruling by Bermuda's Supreme Court last May that allows any 2 people to wed, making the island nation the first country to take away marriage equality rights. In Illinois, an avowed white supremacist and former Nazi leader is poised to win the Republican Party's nomination for a U.S. congressional seat. Arthur Jones, who once headed the American Nazi Party, is running unopposed for Illinois' 3rd congressional district in Chicago's suburbs. This is Jones being interviewed Thursday by CNN's Allison Camerata.
It is shocking to hear how vocally and unapologetically racist you are. Are you a Nazi?
Well, for the past 15, 20 years, I have not had anything to do with any National Socialist organization on a formal basis.
But do you call yourself a Nazi?
I don't call myself a Nazi. I call myself an American patriot and statesman.
White supremacists and the self-styled alt-right movement are responsible for racist violence that's left more than 100 people dead or wounded. That's according to the Southern Poverty Law Center in a new investigation titled "The Alt-Right is Killing People." It finds 13 alt-right-related fatal episodes committed by young white men, including mass shootings in Charleston, South Carolina, Isla Vista, California, Roseburg, Oregon, and Quebec City in Canada. The Southern Poverty Law Center reports, quote, "Websites like Breitbart, Reddit, and 4chan have fueled the growth of the alt-right by spreading radicalizing propaganda designed to nourish white male resentment over cultural and demographic changes," end quote. Ohio's Attorney General filed suit against chemical company DuPont on Thursday, charging the company with illegally dumping a toxic chemical from its Washington Works plant into the Ohio River for decades. The suit charges DuPont released the chemical, which is used in Teflon coating, even though it knew of the dangers of PFOA, also known as C8, which has been linked to cancer, thyroid disease, high cholesterol, and low birth weight in babies. The Ohio lawsuit comes as the Environmental Protection Agency ordered DuPont to test water near its Washington Works plant for another chemical, Genex, which was billed as a replacement for C8, but which is linked to many of the same health problems. To see a full discussion about Teflon, DuPont, and C8, you can go to our discussion at Sundance when we interviewed those involved with the film The Devil We Know. Go to democracynow.org. In Seattle, Washington, federal agents and local police have searched the home of a former U.S. swimming Olympic coach after former world champion Ariana Kukurs said she was sexually abused as a minor. Kukurs says she was sexually assaulted by the coach, Shawn Hutchison, on trips and during training sessions in Seattle, beginning when she was 16 years old. She says Hutchison also took nude photos of her without her consent. President Trump's anti-immigrant policies led to a 30% jump in the number of arrests carried out by ICE last year, according to a new review of ICE data by the Pew Research Center. Even so, 2017 saw far fewer immigration arrests than many of the years that President Obama was in office, including 2009, when ICE arrested nearly 300,000 people, more than double last year's total. The Trump administration is considering a plan that could see immigrants who apply for several forms of U.S. government assistance barred from obtaining visas or green cards. A draft document from the Department of Homeland Security obtained by the website Vox shows the plan would target immigrants who enroll their children in Head Start or the Children's Health Insurance Program, known as CHIP, or who apply for food stamps, housing, home heating, or transportation subsidies. Immigrant rights groups say the draft rules could force many families to choose between subsistence and a chance to become permanent U.S. residents. In Tacoma, Washington, at least 120 immigrants detained by ICE at the Northwest Detention Center have begun a hunger strike, protesting abuses at the hands of guards with the for-profit prison company Geo Group. The prisoners are demanding larger portions of edible, nutritious food, an end to arbitrary searches, and an end to the widespread use of solitary confinement at the prison. And immigrant rights activist Ravi Ragbir, executive director of the new Sanctuary Coalition, heads to court today in New Jersey, where he's challenging his 2001 conviction for wire fraud in a case that could see a judge stay an order for his pending deportation. Ragbir has been ordered to report to a check-in with Immigration and Customs Enforcement on Saturday, which is unusual, in Manhattan, and supporters have secured a permit to protest at 9 a.m. This week, the New York City Council held a hearing about whether the New York Police Department should have helped ICE agents escort Ravi Ragbir when they tried to deport him after his last check-in. This is Ravi Ragbir speaking on Thursday.
I am feeling a lot of terror in my heart. My wife has a lot of terror right now that she is dealing with. Many of you who are here with me are feeling that terror together with me.
This comes as Mayor Bill de Blasio wrote a letter to ICE this week saying the beloved New York City community leader should be allowed to stay, and that Congressmember Nydia Velázquez has introduced a private immigration bill that, if passed, would provide Ragbir with a path toward permanent legal immigration status. Those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In a pair of early morning votes, the House and Senate approved a bill to end a brief overnight shutdown of the U.S. government. The bill raises military and domestic spending by almost $300 billion over the next 2 years. But the bill failed to meet the demands of immigrant rights groups and many Democrats who wanted protection for young, undocumented immigrants whose protections President Trump ended last fall. The government officially shut down at midnight after Republican Senator Rand Paul temporarily blocked the Senate vote. Shortly before 2 a.m., the Senate approved the bill by a vote of 71 to 28. Then, around 5:30 a.m., the House passed the spending bill with a vote of 240 to 186. House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi had urged fellow Democrats to oppose the spending bill because it did not protect dreamers. But 73 Democrats voted yes, helping the measure pass. Pelosi, who staged a record 8-hour speech on the House floor in support of immigration legislation, criticized the Republican leadership for blocking a vote on the dreamers.
There's nothing partisan or political about protecting dreamers. If a DREAM Act were brought to the floor, it would pass immediately with strong bipartisan support. And I commend my Republican colleagues for their courage in speaking out on this. Yet our dreamers hang in limbo with a cruel cloud of fear and uncertainty above them. The Republican moral cowardice must end.
House Majority Leader Paul Ryan vowed to open a discussion on dreamers.
I know that there is a real commitment to solving the DACA challenge in both political parties. That's a commitment that I share. To anyone who doubts my intention to solve this problem and bring up a DACA and immigration reform bill, do not. We will bring a solution to the floor, one that the president will sign. We must pass this budget agreement first, though, so that we can get on to that. So please know that we are committed to getting this done.
We go now to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by Gracia Martinez-Rosas. She is the executive director of United We Dream, a recipient of DACA herself, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program. Gracia, welcome to Democracy Now! What happened last night, early this morning, the votes in the Senate and the House to continue spending for the U.S. government to stop the shutdown, but not dealing with immigrants?
Thanks for having me. Good morning. Yes, this morning we wake up devastated and determined to see that immigrant young people like myself and millions of others are protected from deportation, but devastated because Congress decided to not prioritize us and leave us behind and enable the mass deportation of Donald Trump. You saw yesterday or this morning Democrats who vowed to stay with us and vote no on anything that did not include a DREAM Act renege on that promise. And you saw the same thing, cowardice from Paul Ryan and vulnerable House Republicans that did not stand up for the values and the beliefs of 86% of the American public, that people like myself and my little sister should stay in this country.
So explain what transpired over the last 24 hours, what you understand actually took place behind the scenes. You had this record speech of Nancy Pelosi, the House Minority Leader, that she gave for 8 hours on the floor, she voting no on the continuing spending for the government. And then what do you make of what Paul Ryan, the House Majority Leader, the House Speaker, said?
You know, I think that everything was set in motion the moment that Chuck Schumer on the Senate side decided to end a shutdown without protection for immigrant young people, and at the same time give in to the CAPS deal without the DREAM Act. And so what you saw is then the Senate was able to move to send it over to the House, a CAPS deal, a CR that did not include protection from immigrant young people. You saw Nancy Pelosi on the floor for 8 hours. Talking about our stories, and that is in direct correlation with the power that immigrant young people have built from the community. But you also did not see her or other Democrats ask for a DREAM Act in exchange of their votes. In fact, 73 Democrats voted with Republicans to move forward on this. And so we say to you, we see you. We will not forget. And to those Democrats and some Republicans, like Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, that decided to elevate and to prioritize our lives and vote no on something without a resolution, we also see you and we say thank you.
White House Chief of Staff General John Kelly blasted young immigrants as lazy, telling reporters there are 690,000 official DACA registrants, and the president sent over what amounts to be 2.5 times that number to 1.8 million. The difference between 690,000 and 1.8 million were the people that some would say were too afraid to sign up. Others would say they were too lazy to get off their asses, but they didn't sign up. Kelly said. This is right before he's come under fire for fully lauding the staff secretary in the White House, very close to President Trump, John Porter, for who is now under fire for beating up his 2 wives.
You know, I think that this is yet another signal of the pattern of racism, honestly, and disrespect to young people, people of color, immigrants in this country. I think that General Kelly has seen, or may not have seen, the thousands of immigrant young people that have taken over the Hill and that have been in action for the last couple of months. But I want to say one thing very clear. This Donald Trump administration, they have a clear agenda of wiping immigrant young people and our families from this country. They have a concerted strategy to either deport us or lock us away for profit. And anything and anyone that does not stand in the way of that is an enabler of a white supremacist agenda, and we will not forget. And I want to talk directly now to immigrant young people that might be hearing this, and the 86% of the American public that is with us, and to say that at United We Dream, we are committed to defending our democracy, we are committed to win, and we are committed to making sure that Donald Trump does not continue to separate families.
On Wednesday, Capitol Police arrested immigrant rights activists who held a nonviolent civil disobedience action inside the Senate rotunda. Members of the United We Dream coalition were demanding Congress pass a Clean Dream Act without additional funding for President Trump's expanded border wall or other anti-immigrant measures. This is one of the activists speaking after the arrests.
I saw a marvelous display of family values and what I would refer to as American values. And it was a shame. It was a shame that that display resulted in the arrest of over 14 Dreamers or immigrant youth. And it was just awe-inspiring for all those young people to make a stand and put their lives at risk for the people that they love.
Grace Martinez-Rosas, what next for United We Dream activists and others now that the House and the Senate have voted?
We continue on. Our lives are at stake, and so March 5th is a deadline that Republicans have set themselves to ensure that this happens. We are looking to you to make sure that you stand in the way of enabling Donald Trump. You also will see and continue to see immigrant young people working with folks at the state and local community to make sure that there are protections for immigrants, because there's a lot of things that governors and mayors can do to ensure that families stay together. But one thing is clear. United We Dream has a proven track record of ensuring that we transform devastation and fear into action and into change. And so I think you'll see immigrant young people continuing to lead the way in defending our democracy.
Grace, I want to turn to Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer speaking yesterday.
So I say to Speaker Ryan, allow a fair and open process to debate Dreamers on the floor of the House, just as we are allowing in the Senate. Leader Pelosi shouldn't have to stand and speak for 8 hours. I respect her for doing it, just to secure a vote on an issue as compelling and pressing as Dreamers. What Leader Pelosi is asking for is the same thing we got here in the Senate, no more, no less, a vote and an open process that is undeniably fair.
So I wanted to get your response, Grace, to both what Senator Schumer said and also the fact that Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell is expected to bring up immigration next week in a rare Senate floor debate. What are you expecting from this?
Look, I think we understand that Senator Mitch McConnell set in motion the process for the first floor debate on immigration in a long time. I think that you'll see a lot of partisan positioning. A lot of people putting up amendments that are going to make each other uncomfortable, and in the balance hangs my life and the life of immigrant young people all across the country. And so, you know, our response to Republicans is that there has been a firm pushback against the White House framework that aims to dismantle our immigration system. It aims to add more enforcement into our communities, and that has been clearly rejected by immigrant rights communities. I think that at United We Dream, we are clear that we continue to demand a DREAM Act that does not harm people to help us. We continue to be committed to this country and to our democracy, and we will not allow ourselves to be used as bargaining chips in this process.
Grace, so what does this mean personally for you? You are a DACA recipient. What does that mean right now? Now that Trump has ended DACA, is it ending in March? Everything is so unclear at this point.
Trump killed DACA, and my little sister's DACA expires in August of this year. I don't have anything to bring to her right now to bring her comfort and to tell her that she'll be able to be okay and safe. She lives in the state of Texas where there are racist policies like SB 4 that track young brown people like my little sister. And so I think that what is at stake for me is my heart. What's at stake for me is my belief in this democracy. And hopefully, I know for sure that we shall overcome and that my little sister and I will live safe, and I'm not going to stop until we get there.
I want to thank you very much for being with us. Grace Martinez-Rosas, Advocacy Director for United We Dream. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we go to the Olympics in Korea. Stay with us.
오빤 강남 스타일 강남 스타일 낮에는 따사로운 인간적인 여자 커피 한 잔에 여유를 아는 품격 있는 여자 밤이 오면 심장이 뜨거워지는 여자 그런 반전 있는 여자 너는 선어해 낮에는 너만큼 따사로운 그런 선어해 커피 식기도 전에 원샷 때리는 선어해 밤이 오면 심장이 터져버리는 선어해 그런 선어해 아름다워 사랑스러워 그래 너 hey. 그래 바로 너 hey. 아름다워 사랑스러워 그래 너 hey. 그래 바로 너 hey. 지금부터 갈 때까지 가볼까 오빤 강남 스타일 강남 스타일 오빤 강남 스타일
Gangnam Style by South Korean singer Psy. This is Democracy Now! I'm Mimi Goodman. In Pyeongchang, South Korea, the 2018 Winter Olympics have opened with North and South Korean athletes marching together at the opening ceremonies. The Games are seen as a pivotal moment for relations between the two countries, who've been officially at war since 1950. In an effort to de-escalate tensions on the Korean Peninsula, North Korea has sent a 500-person delegation of athletes, musicians, performers to the Olympics. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un's influential sister attended today's opening ceremony, shook hands with the South Korean leader, Moon Jae-in. The pair are scheduled to have lunch together. But even as the peninsula tries to de-escalate the threat of nuclear war, U.S. Vice President Mike Pence warned the U.S. is slated to impose another draconian round of sanctions against North Korea. Pence is leading the U.S. delegation during today's opening ceremony and will reportedly attend the Games with the father of Otto Warmbier, the American college student who died after being imprisoned in North Korea. This is Pence speaking Thursday.
Allow me to just assure you and the people of South Korea that the United States of America will continue to stand shoulder to shoulder in our effort to bring maximum pressure to bear on North Korea until that time comes when they finally and permanently and irreversibly abandon their nuclear and ballistic missile ambitions.
South Korean President Moon Jae-in held a meeting with Pence in Seoul soon after he arrived in South Korea. This is Jae-in speaking on Thursday.
I would like to make an effort to use this opportunity as much as I can to bring North Korea back to the dialogue table for the North's denuclearization and to build peace on the peninsula. I always emphasize that the most important thing in this process is the airtight cooperation between South Korea and the United States. And I think this moment, being with Vice President Pence, shows the cooperation firmly.
Well, for more, we're joined by Christina Ahn, the founder and international coordinator of Women Cross DMZ, a global movement of women mobilizing to end the Korean War. Christina Ahn, it's great to have you with us, actually in studio today. So talk about the significance of what's happening as we speak in South Korea. A 500-person North Korea delegation marching together with South Korea hasn't happened since 2006.
It's extraordinary. I mean, and I think just happened, within the past hour. North and South Korean athletes marched into the opening ceremony of the Olympics carrying a One Korea flag. Apparently, the entire stadium just broke out in applause. It's just hugely momentous moment that we're in right now. And the only person that didn't allegedly clap was, of course, U.S. Vice President Mike Pence.
Pence, who leads the U.S. delegation. And talk about what he has done, first going to Japan with Shinzo Abe and making the announcement that as North and South Korea come together, at least for these Olympics, the U.S. is imposing more draconian sanctions against North Korea.
Yeah, I mean, just the irony is so deep to be stopping in Tokyo, meeting with Shinzo Abe, whose grandfather was a Class A, war criminal that, hunted down North Korean independence fighters, and to have Shinzo Abe, a former, from Japan, a former colonial occupier of Japan, be with the United States, who is basically throwing shade at this incredible inter-Korean peace process, and to say that we are going to just continue this policy of maximum pressure to force North Korea to denuclearize. I mean, that clearly isn't working, and what we do see is it having extraordinarily negative consequences for civilians in North Korea. So, it feels like there is this incredible, the winds of peace blowing across the DMZ, and then, of course, this very dark cloud hovering over Washington, D.C. that is, really trying to derail this hopeful inter-Korean peace process.
And you have North and South Korea forming a joint women's hockey team?
It's extraordinary. I mean,
what about Moon Jae-in having lunch with Kim Yo-jong, the influential sister of Kim Jong-un? They just shook hands.
Right. It's the first time that a member of the Kim family has stepped foot on South Korean soil. And, she's not just like a figurehead. I mean, my understanding is that Kim Yo-jong is, she's in charge of the light industries in North Korea. So she wields tremendous influence over the country's economy. And, I hope that I hope that they are able to talk about future developments. And, it has been signaled that North Korea will receive, or that North Korea will send an invitation to Moon Jae-in to go to Pyongyang later this year.
The Washington Post reports the White House's original choice for U.S. ambassador to South Korea is no longer expected to be nominated after he privately expressed disagreement with President Trump's North Korea policy. Can you talk about this nominee, Victor D. Cha?
Victor Cha is, what worries me so much is that Victor Cha is pretty well known to be pretty much a hawk. I mean, he's pretty hard-line to the right. He served under the George W. Bush administration. He's a professor at Georgetown. And, what frightens me is that his nomination to become the next South Korean, U.S. ambassador to South Korea is because he opposed this bloody nose strike. And that signals to me that the Trump administration is very much making plans to wage a preemptive strike on North Korea.
I want to turn to President Trump's recent State of the Union.
North Korea's reckless pursuit of nuclear missiles could very soon threaten our homeland. We are waging a campaign of maximum pressure to prevent that from ever happening. Past experience has taught us that complacency and concessions only invite aggression and provocation. I will not repeat the mistakes of past administrations that got us into this very dangerous position. We need only look at the depraved character of the North Korean regime to understand the nature of the nuclear threat it could pose to America and to our allies.
So that's President Trump's State of the Union, where the North Korean defector Ji Sung-ho was also honored. Christine Ahn.
Yes, I mean, you know, as I watched that State of the Union speech, all I could think was, this is so reminiscent of George W. Bush's, you know, Axis of Evil speech, where he basically sought to lay the moral grounds for a U.S. invasion of Iraq. And, you know, calling the North Korean regime a depraved regime, you know, talking about North Korea's, I mean, we know clearly North Korea has some pretty grave human rights abuses, but, you know, to kind of take the suffering of whether it's the family of Otto Warmbier or the North
Pence
Korean
with
defectors.
the father of
right,
Warmbier.
Absolutely, is, you know, basically, you know, using them for their political agenda. And I think that what worries me is, you know, they're trying to build and convince the American people that the liberation, quote unquote, liberation of North Koreans is very much tied to the preservation of America's freedom. I mean, it's, you know, there's no historical context. There's no recognition that the conditions facing so many North Korean people have very much to do with a long history of U.S. economic blockade and aggression that has obviously enabled the country to have the people rally around the Kim regime.
Talk about who Ji Sung-ho is, this North Korean defector who was honored at the State of the Union.
He's a North Korean defector. He, you know, obviously, just as, you know, tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of North Koreans suffered under the famine, you know, which there was, you know, inadequate food.
His financier, Thor Halvorsen?
It's Thor Halvorsen. Actually, Tim Shorrock, who's a, you know, renowned journalist for The Nation, just wrote a piece that's up today about the kind of, you know, some shady back-channel dealings, and that Thor Halvorsen of the Human Rights Foundation, who has this history. I believe his family was part of the attempted coup of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, and is financed, backed by very right-wing funders, and has been part of a very right-wing campaign. They try to send balloons, and even during the Park Geun-hye administration, which is a, you know, very conservative administration, they had asked them, please don't do this, you know, whether they're sending Bibles by balloons or other provocative material that North Korea views as a threat. You know, I think that there is a very concerted effort to try to use defectors to portray a certain narrative about North Korea that sometimes, you know, is on shaky ground.
Last month, you talked about the suffering of the people of North Korea. UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund, warned tens of thousands of North Korean children face potential starvation as sanctions slow the delivery of humanitarian aid. UNICEF's Manuel Fontaine said, quote, "We are projecting that at some point during the year, 60,000 children will become severely malnourished. This is the malnutrition that potentially can lead to death. It's protein and calorie malnutrition. So the trend is worrying. It's not getting any better," he said.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're presented with kind of two false scenarios. I mean, or you know, the way that the Trump administration is saying, okay, we have this military option, which is the bloody strike, or, you know, the preventive war that McMaster is advocating for. And then, but we are on a diplomatic track. Well, this is not a diplomatic track. When it basically includes more and, you know, more draconian sanctions that is not achieving the aim, which is the denuclearization of North Korea, but it is achieving the aim of hurting ordinary civilians, you know, children, women. And, you know, I think that we have to be very vigilant, because what we're going to see is the Trump administration say, okay, we tried this diplomatic path of maximum pressure, but that didn't succeed. So the only option that's left is the one of the military one.
So talk about how South Koreans feel about unification and also young people.
Well, I think it's mixed. I mean, obviously, they see what happened between East and West Germany. I'd say the young people grew up under a generation after the 1997 IMF crisis, and so they've seen their parents suffer, grew up with a lot of economic insecurity and instability. And so, you know, I would say that there is a desire for the eventual reunification of Korea, and I think seeing the two Koreas march together under one Korea flag, you know, we can't underestimate the power of that. I mean, a country that was, you know, divided by Cold War powers, and that remains still in a state of war because there has not been a peace treaty. And so, you know, I think that what we know, whether it's a mixed response about how Koreans feel about reunification, they don't want a new Korean war. And more South Koreans are worried about Donald Trump than they are about Kim Jong-un. And so, you know, I think that the Olympics is presenting a very hopeful opportunity. Hopefully that is the beginning. But obviously, a lot of this depends upon the U.S.
Christine Ahn is the founder and international coordinator of Women Cross DMZ, a global movement of women mobilizing to end the Korean War. When we come back, we go back 15 years this week to an infamous speech that then Secretary of State General Colin Powell gave at the UN, which helped to begin the U.S. invasion of Iraq. 15 years later, are we seeing this kind of rhetoric again towards Iran? Stay with us.
Coming once again, except this time it feels like the world's about to end. White-robed devils in plain sight, angry protests in the streets night after night, and it weighs heavy on my mind. Why are we so quick to run backwards after all this time? But I won't let it change my heart. I was born full of love and hope, and when I die, that's how I'll depart. And when you find yourself incapable of seeing eye to eye, remember when they go low, we go high. Change is coming, that's for sure.
Battle Hymn for an Army of Lovers by Chris Matthews. Here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We turn now to look at the growing threat of war against Iran. In recent weeks, senior members of the Trump administration have repeatedly tried to churn up U.S. support for a war against Iran, while President Trump has reiterated his threats to pull the U.S. out of the landmark 2015 Iran nuclear deal. Last month, President Trump issued a waiver to prevent the reimposition of U.S. sanctions against Iran, but warned he would not do so again unless the nuclear deal is renegotiated. The waiver must be reissued every 120 days to avoid the sanctions from kicking back in. His warning came after U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Nikki Haley spoke at the Anacostia Bowling military base in Washington, D.C. in front of pieces of metal she claimed were parts of an Iranian-made missile supplied to the Houthis in Yemen, which the Houthis allegedly fired into Saudi Arabia. This is Ambassador Haley speaking December 14th.
Behind me is an example of one of these attacks. These are the recovered pieces of a missile fired by Houthi militants from Yemen into Saudi Arabia. The missile's intended target was the civilian airport in Riyadh, through which tens of thousands of passengers travel each day. I repeat, the missile was used to attack an international civilian airport in a G20 country. Just imagine if this missile had been launched at Dulles Airport or JFK, or the airports in Paris, London, or Berlin. That's what we're talking about here. That's what Iran is actively supporting.
Weapons experts widely criticized Ambassador Haley's speech, saying the evidence was inconclusive and fell far short of proving her allegations that Iran had violated a UN Security Council resolution. But to our next guest, Haley's claims were not only inconclusive, They were also oddly reminiscent of the false claims about weapons of mass destruction the George W. Bush administration used to sell the public on the war with Iraq. Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson served as Chief of Staff to Secretary of State Colin Powell from 2002 to 2005, during which time he helped prepare Powell's infamous speech to the UN claiming Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Powell's speech was given 15 years ago this week, February 5th, 2003.
One of the most worrisome things that emerges from the thick intelligence file we have on Iraq's biological weapons is the existence of mobile production facilities used to make biological agents. Let me take you inside that intelligence file and share with you what we know from eyewitness accounts. We have first-hand descriptions of biological weapons factories on wheels and on rails. The trucks and train cars are easily moved and are designed to evade detection by inspectors. In a matter of months, they can produce a quantity of biological poison equal to the entire amount that Iraq claimed to have produced in the years prior to the Gulf War.
That was then Secretary of State General Colin Powell speaking February 5th, 2003 before the UN Security Council. Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, his chief of staff, has since renounced this speech, which he helped write. Well, his new op-ed for the New York Times is headlined, "I helped sell the false choice of war once. It's happening again." Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, welcome back to Democracy Now! Talk about how you felt at the time, how you came to understand the evidence that General Colin Powell, who himself called this speech later a blot on his career, how you put this speech together and the echoes of it, what you hear today in Ambassador Haley's speech.
Amy, we put the speech together with arguably the entire U.S. intelligence community led by George Tenet, the Director of Central Intelligence, literally at Powell's right hand all the time, 7 days, 7 nights, at Langley and then in New York before we presented. When I saw Nikki Haley give her presentation, certainly there was not the gravitas of a Powell, not the statesmanship of a Powell, not the popularity of a Powell. What I saw was a John Bolton, and remember John Bolton was her predecessor in terms of being a neoconservative at the United Nations representing the United States. I saw a very amateurish attempt, but nonetheless these kinds of things, when they're made visual and the statements are made so dramatically, have an impact on the American people. I saw her doing essentially the same thing with regard to Iran that Powell had done and I had done and others with regard to Iraq. So it alarms me. I don't think the American people have a memory for these sorts of things. Gore Vidal called us the United States of amnesia with some reason. So we need to be reminded of how the intelligence was politicized, how it was cherry-picked, how we move towards a war that has been an absolute catastrophe for the region and even long-term for Israel's security and the United States, perhaps, with a deftness and with a fluidity that alarmed me then. It really alarms me now that we might be ready to repeat that process. And your previous speaker on North Korea, there's another target. This president has so many targets out there that he could avail himself of at almost any moment that we have to shudder at the prospects for war and destruction over the next 3 years of Donald Trump's term.
Can you talk about the pieces of metal she was talking about?
I can't imagine how anyone could haul some metal in front of the TV cameras and assert the way she did with the details she did, some of which was false, just flat false, and expect anyone with any expertise, at least, to believe it. Open parentheses, the American people don't necessarily have that expertise, close parentheses. Look at her statement about this could have been shot at Dulles or it could have been shot at Berlin. Had it been shot at Dulles or Berlin, it would have stopped well short, somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean or even shorter. These missiles are not long-range missiles. These missiles are very inaccurate missiles. They have a CEP of miles. That means that unlike a U.S. nuclear weapon, which would hit within a 10-meter circle or less, it would hit within a mile or two circle. They don't know where it's going to hit when they shoot it. It's not very accurate, in other words. So the things that she was presenting there, she was presenting with a drama that even if what she was saying fundamentally was true, that the Houthis got it from Iran and shot it at Saudi Arabia, it simply was so exaggerated that one just looks at it and says, I can't believe that the United States is represented by that woman.
Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, it's very interesting that you have this moment now in U.S. history where the Republicans, some of them, are joining with President Trump in trying to discredit the intelligence agencies. And yet you go back to 2003 when you have a fierce criticism of the intelligence agencies, saying they were being used to politicize information, which oddly is what President Trump is saying in a very different context.
You would have a lot of sympathy if you asked me if I have some doubts about the U.S. intelligence agencies, all 17 of them now, definitely. But let me tell you what I've done over the last 11 or 12 years on 2 university campuses with really brilliant students in terms of enlightening myself, gaining new insights into what happened not only in 2002 and 3, but what's been happening ever since, and for that matter, what happened ever since Richard Nixon with regard to the intelligence communities. What happens is you get people like Tenet, you get people like John Brennan, you get people like John McLaughlin, you get people like Chris Mudd, for example, Phil Mudd, who was head of counterterrorism for George Tenet, and who tried at the last minute to get me to put even more stuff into his presentation about the connections between Baghdad and al-Qaeda. You get people like that who are at the top. That screens all the many dedicated, high moral, high character professionals down in the bowels of the DIA, the CIA, the NSA, and elsewhere. That screens their views, which are often accurate. I'd say probably 80% of the time, very accurate, from the decision makers. So what you get is you get people like Tenet and McLaughlin and Brennan who shape whatever they can to fit the policies that the president wishes to carry out. The intelligence, therefore, gets corrupted. So in that sense, I am still down on the, quote, U.S. intelligence community, unquote.
I mean, it's really interesting because a number of the people you mentioned from the past are the current commentators on television.
Yes. Yes. John McLaughlin lied to the Secretary of State of the United States on more than one occasion during the preparation for the 5 February 2003 UN Security Council.
I want to turn to President Trump speaking to the United Nations General Assembly in September.
The Iran deal was one of the worst and most one-sided transactions the United States has ever entered into. Frankly, that deal is an embarrassment to the United States, and I don't think you've heard the last of it, believe me. It is time for the entire world to join us in demanding that Iran's government end its pursuit of death and destruction. It is time for the regime to free all Americans and citizens of other nations that they have unjustly detained. And above all, Iran's government must stop supporting terrorists, begin serving its own people, and respect the sovereign rights of its neighbors.
Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, respond to President Trump and talk about the clock being put ever closer to midnight.
That agreement, the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement between the UN Security Council permanent members, Germany, Iran, that agreement is probably the most insidious and likely way to war with Iran. The Obama regime, in a very, very difficult diplomatic situation, achieved the best it could. That best is a nuclear agreement that keeps Iran from a nuclear weapon and gives us over a year of time, should they try to secretly break out of it, to inspect and find and to stop, even if we had to bomb. So it is an agreement unparalleled in regard to stopping Iran's search for, if it ever had the desire to, a nuclear weapon. If Trump undermines that, if this administration undermines that, then there is no, and they are moving fast to do that, there is no other alternative if you look at it. Now, my colleagues and some of my opponents in this will say, oh, no, that doesn't necessarily mean war. It certainly does if you continue this march towards Iran's unacceptability of Iran's having a nuclear weapon. Because then we will have intelligence telling us that Iran is, I know the Foundation for Defense of Democracy and others will never let this rest. We will have everyone telling us that Iran, whether they are or not, is going after a nuclear weapon once the agreement is abrogated. That means the only way you assure the American people and the international community, the region, Saudi Arabia salivating for a war with Iran, with American lives at the front, that means the only way you stop Iran under those circumstances is to invade. 500,000 soldiers and troops, you better have some allies, 10 years, $4 or $5 trillion. And at the end of that 10 years, it looks worse than Iraq did at the end of its 10. That's what you're looking at over the long haul if you say this agreement is no good and abrogate it. Because if it's still unacceptable that Iran not get a nuclear weapon, the only way that you assure that is by invasion. Bombing won't do it. All bombing will do is drive them underground. They'll develop a weapon. They'll work with the North Koreans and so forth. We know they have worked with the North Koreans in the past, and they will develop one. And then they'll be like Kim Jong-un. They'll present us with the fait accompli. Nuclear proliferation is a real threat right now, and I agree with the bulletin of the Atomic Scientist Bulletin that the hands on the doomsday clock are now at 2.5 minutes or so from midnight. We are more in danger of a nuclear exchange on the face of the earth than we were in probably any time since 1945, and that includes the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 and the Berlin crisis that more or less preceded it. This is a dangerous time, and we have a man in the White House who is a dangerous president.
Colonel Wilkerson, on Wednesday, Defense Secretary James Mattis defended a Pentagon request to develop new so-called low-yield nuclear weapons, telling reporters the U.S. needed a more complete range of nuclear options. And this comes as the Trump administration has unveiled its new nuclear weapons strategy, which involves spending at least $1.2 trillion to upgrade, they say, the U.S. nuclear arsenal. Your response?
Make that about $2 to $3, maybe even $4 trillion, because that's what the cost overruns will be, and that's what we'll spend over the next 10 to 15 years to do this, and we do not need it. Just look at some of the components of this. We're looking at a B-21 bomber for the Air Force, for example, that's going to be so expensive the Air Force won't even tell the Congress how much it's going to cost. We're looking at a nuclear-tipped cruise missile for that bomber, which negates the need for the bomber. It's redundant, but we're going to do it anyway. This is to assuage the military-industrial complex in America that deals with nuclear weapons. This is to spend lots of money and keep lots of nuclear scientists and others in their jobs. I understand that, but I don't condone this kind of money being spent. This is to respond to the Russians, whose military doctrine now includes using small-yield nuclear weapons should they be invaded by NATO. It's written in their doctrine. This is to further perturbate the situation with the Chinese, who are taking Mao Zedong's nuclear philosophy and throwing it out the window and thinking, oh, maybe we better build lots more nuclear weapons so we can ride out a first strike and retaliate. This is all because of the United States. It's all because of what's happening in the world post-Cold War that we all thought was going to be more peaceful and is turning out to be more catastrophically
Colonel Wilkerson,
dangerous.
Trump just tweeted, just signed bill. He's talking about the spending bill. Our military will now be stronger than ever before. We love and need our military and gave them everything and more. First time this has happened in a long time. Your last 10-second response.
No, not the first time. Ronald Reagan did it, 82, 83, 84, and he did it on politicized intelligence about the Soviet Union. We knew it was falling apart at that time, but that didn't go along with his arms buildup. That's exactly what Trump is doing, and he's using the military to gain more votes.
Well, I want to thank you so much for being with us. Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson served as the Chief of Staff of the Secretary of State of Colin Powell from 2002 to 2005. That does it for our show. Very happy birthday to Mohammed Tajin, Democracy Now!, produced by Mike Burke, Renee Feltz, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Laura Gottesdiener, Sam Alkoff. Check us out on Facebook, Roku, Instagram, and more. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.